Alrighty, good morning everybody. Welcome to the history of the everyday, starting with the potato, the humble potato. You may think you know all there is to know about a potato. We shall see. Okay, now the point of this series of the history of everyday things is to show how just something as humble as a potato has way much more going on, much more rich history, much more influence on the events of the world than you may think. Just the potato itself is an undervalued hero of our society, because whether it's baked, fried, boiled, roasted, chips, fries, you've all eaten a potato, probably, okay? But they've been much more significant in history than you may realize. They're not just a dietary staple. Without the potato, modern civilization may not exist at all. Whoa, that's a big statement. Let's see how. Okay, so does the potato get the recognition it deserves? Well, I would argue not. That's the whole point of this presentation, but you can decide for yourself at the end. So, usually when we think of potato, we think of this friendly little character, but in actual fact, there are thousands of varieties, and believe it or not, there is an international potato center in Peru that stocks almost 5,000 different versions of the potato. Well, let's get into it, okay? So, it is the world's fourth largest food crop, following rice, wheat, and maize. Maize is the general overall term for corn. So it's kind of a big deal, okay? But in actual fact, it's the third most important if you think of what humans actually eat, because a lot of corn, a lot of maize is actually used for different sorts of purposes. You can make fuels out of it, and a lot of it is actually farmed and created to feed to animals. It is animal feed more than anything else. So in terms of what humans eat, it goes rice, wheat, potatoes, okay? More than 1 billion people worldwide eat potatoes, and the global crop production exceeds 300 million metric tons, which is heavier than, well, everything, okay? So the first people to cultivate the potato were actually in Peru, okay, in the Andes Mountains, the Inca Indians, okay? And they started to cultivate potatoes from around 8,000 to 5,000 BC, so that's 3,000 year window. Now, the reason we say that is there is evidence people were eating potatoes as early as 8,000 BC, but there's not necessarily as much evidence to say that it was particularly and deliberately farmed. It may have been just a happenstance, you know, local phenomena thing. But by 5,000 BC, we're definitely certain they were farming potatoes. So, how did they get to Europe? 1536, the first Spanish conquer Peru, and they come across the flavors of the potato, and of course they bring it to Europe. Sir Walter Raleigh, the famous British sailor, he introduces potatoes to Ireland and the UK in 1589, but potatoes don't really get to Europe until about the 1630s, 1640s, and they weren't particularly popular when they first came to Europe. A lot of people thought they tasted like dirt. They were not particularly popular. So just quickly, what that means is if you were ever watching a medieval movie or TV show or something like that, and in medieval times they're making a stew and they throw a potato in there, they just failed history class, because there were no potatoes in medieval Europe. They didn't get here until after 1536, and they weren't popular for the first 200 years pretty much. So they definitely didn't eat them in medieval times. Alrighty, so now this is pretty interesting. In terms of the history of farming a potato, there is no actual solution as to how it went from a poisonous growth, which is how the potato originated on planet Earth, into an edible food. That would have been a deliberate thing by Peruvian, by Incan farmers, but we don't know how they did that or why they did that. But thank goodness they did. Okay, because once they managed to do that, they had almost an unlimited food supply because they live in the Andes Mountains, up to 4,000 meters high. There's not a lot of farmland in Peru, and all down Chile, in fact, very mountainous region, not a lot of space for food crops. So the fact that they could grow potatoes all the way up the mountain, it made their farmland much more expansive than in other places in the world. And also, you don't need as much land to grow potatoes because they are not grown from seeds, as a matter of fact, which means you don't need to spend as much time resting your field so you don't sap them of nutrients, things like this. They're actually an amazing plant, okay? So this is pretty cool. In October 1995, the potato becomes the first vegetable to be grown in space. Now, when I say that's pretty cool, what that means is NASA actually looked at all of the different food options they had for their astronauts, and they actually believe that the potato is the future of feeding space colonies because it can grow pretty much anywhere. In fact, if anyone has seen the movie The Martian, starring Matt Damon, where he's, it's a fictional movie, but he is stranded on Mars, left behind, and the only way he is able to feed himself is by figuring out a way to grow potatoes. He lives only off potatoes for the time that he's there. Now, that is a fictional story, but it was based off of real NASA science. They actually think that's what they're going to do if they ever do have a colony or colonists on Mars. Okay, so that's the future of the potato. But what about the past? Well, here's what we need to understand. Why potatoes? Okay, potatoes are actually incredibly, incredibly nutritious for you. They are great for you. They're a great source of particular nutrients, particular vitamins. They're not too heavy in calories. So they actually feature more potassium than a banana. They get more of your daily dose of vitamin C than if you were to say eat an orange or drink orange juice. They have more iron per gram than a serving of beef. And in fact, in 2004, potatoes began formal nutrition research program with the goal of creating a body of scientific evidence highlighting the nutritional benefits of potatoes. Essentially, they think potatoes should be classified as a superfood, not acai berries or sunflower seeds or whatever it is that you read in your latest edition of Goop magazine that I assume you all have at home. So that is why potatoes are so useful. That's why they're so important. But what made them catch on? Well, they are actually a cure for a lot of famine. Maybe you have heard of the potato famine, which was a disaster that hit Ireland between 1845 and 1851. About 1 million people died through starvation and other particular circumstances related to famine. And lots of people left Ireland. It led to mass emigration, people leaving the country of Ireland. So before we dive into this particular potato famine, we have to realize why this one particular crop was so important. Well, in actual fact, going back through history, whether or not you know this, when potatoes bloom, they actually have these amazing flowers, these purple stars, if you will. And there's pictures of the famous Marie Antoinette and King Louis decorating their clothes with these particular flowers that they were growing. And the French aristocracy started putting all of these potato flowers into their clothes because the French were actually trying to do a propaganda campaign for the potato. They were actually trying to advertise it. They were essentially being the 1700s or 18th century version of Instagram influencers and trying to get the brand going because they knew that the potato was a great way of curing or solving the problem of famine, okay? Because, for example, in what they'd seen in the Kingdom of Prussia, when it was hit by a famine in 1744, this king, who became known as King Frederick the Great, mainly thanks to the potato, he was a potato enthusiast after all, ordered the peasantry to eat potatoes. Remember, potatoes are incredibly unpopular. People think they taste like dirt. They don't want to eat them. The king ordered it, and all of a sudden, they start eating these potatoes. They start coming up with these particular recipes, and it starts to be a bit of a staple in German culture, and it exports from there. As I say, the French saw what happened in Germany. They solved their famine crisis with potatoes, and they thought it would be great to solve their issues that they were having at the time. Now, unfortunately, that what they were up against was there is a historical encyclopedia from the Enlightenment, or the greatest thinkers of the time. And there's an entry in this particular encyclopedia, and it says, no matter how you prepare it, the root is tasteless and starchy. It cannot be regarded as an enjoyable food. It provides abundant, reasonably healthy food for men who want nothing but sustenance. So they knew how good it was in terms of vitamins, but they definitely did not enjoy the taste. But just taking France as an example, a historian, and forgive my terrible pronunciation, but a French historian by the name of Fernand Brundal calculated that there were at least 40 famines between 1500 and 1800, which is about one per decade. But that is probably an undercount, because that doesn't take into account small localized famines. Okay, so a famine in the southwest of France doesn't necessarily make the history books. Okay, but France was not an exceptional country in terms of famine. England had 17 national famines in the same time. Europeans just could not feed themselves. Okay, hence the potato. The same way that the Peruvians and the Incans had figured out, hey, we can't grow enough food, let's grow potatoes in 8000 BC. Europeans figured that out just, what, 10,000 years later, okay, or give or take. So the potato starts to become more popular. And because of that, it starts solving the famine crisis everywhere. In fact, the potato became an absolute staple. Okay, in all countries, they start growing more and more potatoes. Okay, every year farmers would have to leave a lot of their land fallow, which means they'd leave it empty because they have to rest the soil so that the nutrients can recover, as previously discussed. But by growing potatoes, you don't need to worry about that. So you were able to, what we saw in the 1700s, early 1800s, was a doubling of the food supply. Okay, the historian William H. McNeill argued that the potato actually led to the British Empire. He states, by feeding it rapidly growing populations, permitted a handful of European nations to assert dominion over most of the world between 1750 and 1950. Nowhere is this more true than in Great Britain. Remember, Britain included Ireland at the time. Okay, so they thought they'd solved all of their issues by growing potatoes, but this is the problem. This is where you get your saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket, or don't put all your potatoes in one field, perhaps, because we get this famine. Now, this famine was caused by a mold spore, okay? And it is called Phytophthora infestans, and obviously that was pronounced in perfect Latin, but what it translates to as vexing plant destroyer. Now, scientists have traced it back. They think it started in Peru, so this particular mold spore started in Peru. But the amount of trade that was going between South America and Europe at the time meant that this particular mold was able to spread. And so it arrives in Ireland in 1845, and it creates all sorts of problems, okay? In just 2 months, it had wiped out the equivalent of 1/2, or perhaps even as much as 3/4 of a million acres of farmland. and it got worse the next year. Okay, so they had basically only this crop as their staple, and this fungus, this mold that they'd never seen before, starts wiping out their supply. Okay, so this is a really, really big issue because in Ireland, the population is mostly rural, and it had been growing, rising. The population started at 2 million. In 1741, but just 100 years later, that is up to 8.75 million. Okay, so that is a gigantic increase in population, all thanks to the humble potato. But thanks to this famine, there was a real big issue because these rural populations were just so dependent on the potato, not just in terms of what they eat, it's also what they sold, it's what they traded in. So because they didn't have these potatoes to eat, well, we'll just go buy something else, but they can't because the other source of their income was in trading potatoes. So they've got nothing to eat, but they've also got no money to buy anything else to eat. So this is why it hit Ireland so hard. They had literally come to rely on the potato. Okay, the population fall in Ireland can be seen on this particular map. You can see there are a couple of places that see a rise in population over that 10-year period. That particular rise is very, very minor, I should point out, in those 3 locations. But everywhere else, you can see the population is falling by 10%, 20%, up to 30%. In some places, more than 30% of the population is gone. Okay, so it didn't just lead to people dying, people starving to death, but also a lot of people are like, this is a crisis we can't deal with. We've got to get out of here. So they start leaving, they start emigrating, okay? Mass migration. And this results in 2 different sorts of instances. The effect it has on Ireland, obviously, is it reduces their population. So they were at 8 million in 1840. By 1900, they're at 4 million, half their population, okay? And not only that, but in terms of the local culture in Ireland, because all these people are leaving, it sees a decline in the traditional Irish language, the traditional Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, that was spoken by half the population in 1840, but only 15% of the population by 1900, because in this crisis, you needed to learn to speak English so that you could talk to British settlers or talk to traders on how to get some sort of supplies into your villages. Speaking in your native language would have only led to more shortages. So the actual language of Irish, or Gaelic Irish, sort of declines to the point that it's not necessarily even thought about as a language today. So we see massive, massive, massive changes. Now, in terms of the population being 4 million in 1900, today, or should I say the latest data for which statistics are available, which was yesterday, the population of Ireland is 4,929,191. So you can see it's basically stayed the same since 1900. So they've basically never recovered from the potato famine. So the country of Ireland is changed, but also all those people, where did they go? Well, they went to places in America, they went to places in New Zealand, they went to places in Canada, they went to places in Australia. They settled. They went and they turned all of these places into migrant populations of Irish people. So that the Irish culture is exported all around the world. So that something like, say, for example, St. Patrick's Day becomes a worldwide holiday, a worldwide phenomenon celebrated in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, not so much in England for some reason. More on that in perhaps another presentation. But it becomes a national thing. Whereas St. George's Day, England's National Day, I didn't even know what that was until I moved here 5 years ago. So you can see it changes the world just because of this particular famine. And I was fortunate enough to be in the city of Boston just over a decade ago now for their St. Patrick's Day. And even though the people there, their parents were born in America, their grandparents were born in America, some people's great-grandparents were born in America, they still so closely associate themselves with that Irish culture. So much so that my favorite basketball team, of course, which is in Boston, is still called the Celtics, which is how the Americans say Celtic. But anyway, so what else has the potato done? Well, French fries and potato chips, very, very brief history, if you will. So This was actually done by accident. A chef by the name of Coligny, who was the chef for the French king, unintentionally, by accident, created the French fry because he had made some potatoes for the king, but the king, being the king, was obviously very busy or very lazy. No, I don't know. I'm not sure necessarily in this case, but he was late for dinner. So he had to reheat the potatoes he'd made for him. How did he think to do that in the 1800s with no microwave? Well, he just put them back into the oil. When he put them into the oil, they start puffing up and they start becoming these things he's never seen before, no one's ever seen before. And he's like, well, I've got nothing else to serve. So he serves them, and the king loves them. And that is why they are called French fries, because that particular incident obviously takes place in France. The recipe goes all around the world and changes over the years, but they maintain that name, French fries, until 2003, but that's another lesson. Google freedom fries if you're interested. Okay, but another major thing happens in 1853. This is in the United States of America. This guy named Cornelius Vanderbilt of the Vanderbilt family fortune. He was a railway tycoon. And he is on this particular train, and he serves some potatoes, and he says, these are cut too thick. I don't want them. Get them, send them back to the kitchen. I want them a bit thinner than this. And the chef gets a little bit insulted, and so he decides, I know what I will do. I will cut them the thinnest things anyone has ever seen. And so he does that. And he's like, haha, hope that's thin enough for you. But he absolutely loved them. Vanderbilt loved them, and that is where we get crisps or potato chips from. And this is why they should in fact be called potato chips, by the way, because that's what they were called by their inventor, not crisps. So the word crisps is an English invention, which is why in Australia they're called potato chips. In America they're called potato chips. Canada they're called potato chips. Everywhere except England they're called potato chips. So when you guys say they should be called crisps, no, you came up with that. Americans invented them. They were invented in America. America said they were called potato chips, and English people said, no, we're not doing that. We're calling them crisps. So just so you know, that's an English thing. The rest of the English-speaking world, which is, you know, hundreds of millions of people worldwide, calls them potato chips. So you're actually in the minority on that one, just so you know. Okay. Now, this one's a particular funny story. Did a potato choose the president of the United States? Well, kind of yes, kind of no. This took place in 1992. This guy named Dan Quayle, who had been the vice president, he was running to be the president that year. So he wanted a promotion. He was in an election. And there was a spelling bee in this place called Trenton, New Jersey. And a young man named William, he was called to spell potato. And so he goes up to the board and he writes potato. Yay, well done, fantastic. So then what happened? Well, as the student stepped back, the VP, short for VP, Vice President, said, excuse me, I think you need to put another letter on the end of that. And he made him spell it with an E, okay? So he then made him add it as P-O-T-A-T-O-E, potato, toe, like the toes you have on your feet. That is incorrect. You will never, ever misspell the word potato now, because you know that this ruined the chances of this man, Dan Quayle, to become president. How did it ruin? Well, essentially speaking, first of all, I should just point out, the school actually gave him a card that had potato with an E on the end of it. So Quayle maybe didn't mess up, but the school did. And Quayle might have been better served knowing how to spell potato before someone handed it to him on a card, perhaps. Anyway, he was made fun of for this. Oh my God, this guy can't spell potato. This guy can't spell potato. The 12-year-old can spell potato, and this guy running for president cannot. So he was competitive. He had a chance of being president up to that point, but after that, he plummeted. He lost popularity, and he never became president. Instead, we ended up with President Bill Clinton. So interesting to note that in 1992, people thought it was important for the President of the United States to be smart. obviously the world has changed since then. Okay, so in conclusion, guys, I hope you have seen how the potato has absolutely changed the world. If you think you've learned something, or you want to prove that you do know how to spell potato, then you can take the short trivia quiz after engaging with this video. And who knows, you might prove yourself to be smart enough to become President of the United States in 1992. Obviously, these days, it doesn't matter if you can spell potato or not. It doesn't seem to matter about anything. Ooh, political. Okay, so that is the first history of everyday items. I hope you have enjoyed. I hope you engage with the resources, and I hope you can show me that you know how to spell potato. Have a good day, guys, and I'll talk to you next time.